Ever since being introduced in the 2002 booster set Expedition, supporter cards have played a key role throughout the history of Pokemon's TCG. Whether it might be drawing cards, powering up your Pokemon, or disrupting your opponent, they're a key part of any deck strategy. So in this list, we'll take a look at some of the best supporter cards that have impacted the game at the time they were introduced in. And at number 10, we have Colress's Experiment. Being released in the Sword and Shield Lost Origin expansion, this card is the backbone of the so-called Lost Zone decks, as it allows you to look at 5 cards, choose 3 of them to go directly to your hand, while put the other 2 into the Lost Zone, removing them from play. This deck's goal is to get at least 10 cards into the Lost Zone to use Stabilized Lusamine attack, to place damage counters on your opponent's field to set or pick up knockouts on your opponent's Pokemon. This, however, is only where the deck hits its power ceiling, with Cramorant being able to attack for no energies with its attack Spit Innocently to deal 110 damage, or Mirage Gate at 7 cards in the Lost Zone to power up various attackers by being able to attach 2 different types of energies to your Pokemon in play. In order to get to these numbers, the deck had 2 main goals. One side was Comfy's Flower Selecting ability, so lets you look at your top 2 cards of your deck and put one into the Lost Zone, while the other card goes directly into your hand. And the other, Colress's Experiment, which allows you to put 2 cards into Lost Zone each time you play it, allowing you to quickly access your key pieces while removing cards you won't need any longer to fuel your attacks. Back in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver era of the Pokemon TCG, a supporter with a similar effect called Sage Trainings existed. It, however, only allowed you to choose 2 cards that would have gone to your hand and also didn't have an archetype behind it that heavily benefited from discarding 3 cards. And at number 9, we have a card that should have never been printed with the text that it has. Lusamine allows you to pick up 2 cards in any combination of Stadium and Supporter cards, allowing you to regain access to your resources at the cost of your Supporter for the turn, making it an ideal card for slower types of decks that didn't mind not using a Supporter card to draw cards for a turn in favor of giving them new access to their matchup relevant cards in the upcoming turns. This card, however, came with a huge design flaw. The fact that Lusamine was able to pick itself up from the discard pile meant that it could infinitely loop her if you had 2 of them in circulation. This loop in combination with a ton of disruptive stadiums and supporter cards created a bunch of decks that were considered unhealthy to the game due to their oppressive nature, and now thanks to Lusamine, infinite resources. This eventually led to it being banned in Pokemon's expanded format, a secondary format that features any card from Black and White onwards. It has since been unbanned as other problematic cards have been put on there instead, limiting the damage it can cause. And at number 8, we have Marnie. This card has both players shuffle their hands and put them at the bottom of their decks, after which the user draws 5 new cards, while their opponent only gets 4. This already makes Marnie a very unique card, as every comparable card in the past has always forced players to shuffle their hand into their deck instead of putting them at the bottom. What might seem like a small detail at first, it is a lot more significant than it seems, as a lot of decks try to build up their hand with a variety of options to use in response to their opponent's plays. Marnie mitigates this strategy, forcing players to first find a way to shuffle their decks after it's been used to get the cards back into the potential draws from the top. This can cause a lot of frustration to the player that got hit by this card, but also opens up new strategic routes for either player. Pokemon like Oranguru from Sword and Shield allows a player to exchange one of their cards in the hand with the top card of their deck, with its Primate Wisdom ability. Its ability to disrupt your opponent in key situations, and being able to put your opponent to only 4 cards as early as the first turn that you can use a supporter, makes Marnie an ever-relevant threat in the game that can win games by itself, if not respected enough by your opponent. In 7th place is one of the aforementioned problematic supporter cards that Lusamine was able to recover, Lieutenant Surge's Strategy, which allowed the user to use 2 additional supporter cards after it was used. As expected, an effect that is as strong as this one comes with some kind of drawback. In this case, it's a condition that the player using this card has to have taken less prize cards than their opponent, creating its intended use of being a comeback card for the player losing the game. This, however, becomes a problem if you factor in decks in the Pokemon TCG that have no intention of winning the game by taking prizes, or at the very least plan on draining their opponent's resources by doing so. At first, this wasn't too much of a problem, and Lieutenant Surge's strategy mostly fulfilled niche or gimmick uses, while some people already kept a close eye on it, just waiting for a way to heavily abuse being able to use more supporter cards during a turn. This moment came not even half a year after its release when the Unified Minds release Reset Stamp, shortly before the 2019 World Championships, an item card that would shuffle your opponent's hand into their deck, after which they would draw new cards equal to the number of the remaining prize cards. This, in combination with the previously mentioned Mars supporter cards that lets its user draw 2 cards while discarding a card from their opponent's hand, meant that you'd be able to remove all cards from your opponent's hand by combining Reset Stamp with Lieutenant Surge's Strategy and 2 copies of Mars. On top of that, Chip Ice Axe would allow you to look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck, pick one that would remain on top, and shuffle the rest back into the deck. This strategy became even more powerful when the Jesse and James supporter cards were released that discarded 2 cards in both players' hands, meaning you can get your opponent to no cards in their hand even faster. Surge in combination with these cards already caused the creation of multiple good control decks in Standard, but Expanded was an entirely different beast. As I mentioned before, Lusamine was banned until other cards took its place, and the cards we just went over are exactly these. Even today, all these cards besides Mars are still banned, among others that allowed you to regain access to them, showing how powerful they were when put together. And at number 6, we have a place occupied by the oldest card on this list. Steven's Advice allows its owner to draw cards equal to the amount of Pokemon that your opponent has in play, as long as the prior hand size didn't exceed 7 cards, including this card. This card provided an incredible boost in consistency to many decks due to its immense draw power, thanks to most decks filling up the majority of their bench space. Similar cards have been printed since, but none of them have made their way into decks the same way that Steven's Advice did, being a staple throughout its lifespan. The card that came closest to replicating the card's success was Erica's Hospitality from Team Up, with the difference of Erica's Hospitality could only be used if you had 4 or less cards in hand, making her slightly harder to use than Steven's Advice. On top of that, Erica's Hospitality had to compete with a much larger selection of powerful draw supporters and support Pokemon. It, however, still managed to find a place in some decks as an additional draw option, showing how good Steven's Advice must have been more than 10 years prior. And at number 5, there's a supporter effect that has been reprinted many times at this point, causing this spot to be shared with multiple cards at once. Professor Juniper, Professor Sycamore, and the various versions of Professor's research featuring popular professors from the video games and the Pokemon Go, such as Magnolia, Juniper, Willow, Oak, and Rowan, allowing the player to discard their entire hand and draw 7 new cards. Ever since the first printing of Professor Juniper in black and white, this effect has been a staple in many decks whenever these cards were around, but not without controversy. Back when it was first released, some players didn't like the direction the game was heading into, requiring players to discard their valuable resources instead of being able to hold on to them like it had been often the case before that. By now though, discarding your cards in favor of drawing through your deck has become something that players are used to, and the large variety and draw supporters that the game provides players with nowadays makes it possible to avoid it if your deck can't afford to discard too many cards, making the decks that can utilize these cards incredibly powerful. And at number 4, we have one that goes to one of, if not the most dominant archetype-specific supporter. Welder allows the user to attach up to 2 fire energies to one of their Pokemon, after which they get to draw 3 cards. This, in combination with other powerful fire supporter cards at the time, allowed Welder decks to completely dominate the format to the point that 3 international level events featured 2 Welder decks, each in the grand finals. The 2019 World Championship had Blazeful GX go up against Mewtwo and Mew GX, with the latter taking the title of World Championship. The 2019 Latin American International Championships featured a Reshiram and Charizard GX decks against Mewtwo and Mew GX, with Reshiram and Charizard coming out on top. And the 2020 Oceania International Championships once again put these 2 decks up against each other, with Mewtwo and Mew being victorious the second time the 2 decks met on the international stage. All of these decks made use of a variety of different attackers that would be powered up with Welder to use powerful attacks that would normally not have been able to attack as quickly, making them the clear best decks during that time. While there have been other supporters, none of them were as popular and able to work by just playing 4 copies of that one supporter, something that Welder decks managed to make work. This incredible dominance earns this card a well-deserved place on this list, and only time will tell if a supporter will ever be able to match its success in the future. And at number 3, we have a card that shaped the way the game is played today, and another one, just like the Professor cards earlier, that has been reprinted into multiple different names. Boss's Orders, or Lysandre, how it's called during its first release, allows the players to pick one of their opponent's bench Pokemon and switch it with their active Pokemon, allowing for targeted knockouts, or other purposes like leaving up a Pokemon that won't be able to retreat or switch out as easily by the next turn. Or, in extreme cases, even win the game by deck out because there are no ways left to get it out of the active spot. Before Lysandre was first printed in Furious Fists, players had to work harder to get those bench knockouts by using abilities, item, or supporter cards with heavy drawbacks, or even dedicate their entire deck strategy to being able to just not hit the active Pokemon. This card allowed for players to simply splash it into any kind of deck, and it didn't just change the way the game was, or still is, played, but even change deck building itself, forcing players to respect the possibility that some Pokemon might not stay on the bench for long. This game warping influence earns Lysandre and Boss's Orders a well-deserved spot on this list. And at number 2, we have another card that's been known under multiple names, and another one that changed how the game was played during their existence, much like our previous entry. Rocket's Admin and In both shuffle both players' hands into their deck, after which they would draw cards equal to their prize cards remaining, making them both a powerful draw supporter and also valuable disruption cards. Their early game use would often simply be getting a hand refresh in order to set up your Pokemon in general strategy, after which you could still use it to put your opponent to a low amount of cards in hand after they've drawn multiple prize cards. This strategy became especially effective when the player who was using these cards hadn't taken a lot of prize cards yet, making it a draw and disruption card at the same time. While they were legal for play, both of them were definite staples that made it into every deck, with only very small exceptions. Their legacy was solidified with Rocket's Admin got a unique printing in Pokemon's 25th anniversary set celebrations, and even today, these cards are usually what a lot of top players call for to be reprinted, especially when they feel like a format is getting stale or offers too little comeback options. And at number 1, we've got Lysandre's trump card. This card shuffles both players' discard piles back into their deck, besides other copies of Lysandre's trump card in either player's discard pile. This in itself functions as a reset button for resources and can completely flip the game around that would have normally been dedicated to either player having used up any specific card they might need to win the game. Technically, you would be able to see this kind of reset 8 times per game if both players were playing 4 copies of it. This kind of loop became a lot easier though, thanks to Versus Seeker, an item card that allows its user to pick a support card from the discard pile to put into their hand. Since Versus Seeker worked as an additional copy of Lysandre's trump card that didn't share the name itself, players would be able to reset their discard piles as many times as they wanted, as long as they had a copy of Versus Seeker available. Since Versus Seeker by itself was already a staple card in most decks, this became a very easy feat to accomplish. While some decks simply use Lysandre's trump card to gain additional access to resources, others played energy removal and healing cards that they would loop until they could win the game. At first, this didn't seem like much of an issue, as control types of decks aren't unhealthy to the game by nature, as they simply use different strategies to win the games. This, however, became an issue when Shaman EX was released. Its setup ability allowed the player to draw cards until they had 6 cards in their hand. Since its ability wasn't limited to being once per turn, and access to cards like Super Scoop Up that, upon flipping heads on a coin flip, allowed you to pick Shaman EX back up, led to a strategy where players were able to draw their entire decks turn after turn, ending it with using Lysandre's trump card to have every resource available at the beginning of the next one. This was too much for the Pokemon Company, and led to the first ban since the early 2000s, and being the first ever supporter card that this happened to. Even today it remains on the ban list in the Pokemon Expanded format, and doesn't seem possible that it will ever be allowed to come back, making it the single best supporter in the history of the Pokemon TCG. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other good cards I may have missed, or have ideas for future videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.